Hello everyone, my name's Andrew Knight and I lead the RICS Tech Partner Programme here at the RICS. I've been with RICS for over 10 years now. I work now in our standards regulatory and thought leadership part of the organisation, and my role is to look at the effect globally for our members and our industry of data and tech and Proptech business models. A really interesting and a very wide-ranging role here, and a key part of that is our Tech Partner Programme. And I'm really pleased today to have Merilee Karr join us from Under The Doormat to talk about their business model. So Merilee, do join me.
Good afternoon.
Hi, how are you doing?
Fantastic. No, it's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be a part of the program.
That's great. Well, the first question I always ask, and it's arguably a bit formulaic, but it's great to get under the skin of the Proptech firms that we talk to and work with. What's your background and the background of your team, and how did you get into this particular platform? Give us a bit of a backstory there, Merilee, if you would.
Yeah, so my background's actually a bit different. I came from the corporate world, so I worked in Shell for about 13 years, but amongst other things, doing global strategy in the retail business and setting up the IT presence in India. I also managed the maintenance of 12,000 petrol sites across 43 countries. So property management in a very different world.
Yeah.
And I left because I could see the emergence of the short-term rental sector. Obviously, back in 2008, Airbnb was born, and that really gave more prominence to a sector that was around, prior to that. But it also, for me, was an opportunity because I felt, as someone who traveled myself very frequently, that I would only rent out my property to a stranger if it was going to be professionally managed and there would be the right standards. And so I created Under the Doormat because I believed that at the high end of the market, the big opportunities were going to be around the professionalization of this new market. And that's how Under the Doormat was founded. And very quickly, what we realized was that technology was going to be the key to the growth of this sector. And that's where we've now created the products Hosperia and also now Trusted Stays, which is an industry platform for the professional operators in the sector. But I'm sure we'll come on to that a bit later.
Indeed. Well, as you say, I mean, working for downstream Shell, I guess that felt a very different environment to now, going into the property industry. I mean, what was your perception, dare I say it, warts and all of the property sector when you came into it from such a different industry?
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess I was always in a global industry. I worked in global roles and things like that. So I think for me, having set up my company here in the UK, I was in a way surprised at actually how traditional the property sector is and how conservative it is. It really does feel like if you don't come from this industry, that it's really hard to grow the networks and really get inside of it. But also, it's a sector which has been really profitable for many, many years. And therefore, the appetite for innovation has not been as great as I would have expected it to be. And obviously, coming from, a tech product and tech background, I would have expected that given the size of the opportunities that tech can drive in this sector, that there would have been more appetite. But I'm hopeful that COVID is now starting to shift that.
Yeah, indeed. And I suppose it's interesting in the sense that clearly a lot of our members and our profession, both in the UK and globally, are involved in kind of brokerage of property. But I guess this more short-term specific area is probably sort of something that they're less aware of in terms of the trends and the pace of change. I'm sure we're all aware of Airbnb on a kind of almost a personal base, but so much of our profession has perhaps been looking at the more traditional, longer term rental and obviously conveyancing and buying and sell property itself. What are some of the key trends that you're seeing that would help our members understand how this short-term rental model is changing and evolving?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think in some ways, a great analogy is to take a look at the commercial real estate market. And if we think about the emergence of WeWork and that idea that people don't always want to sign longer term leases, I find in some ways it's quite contradictory because you have government arguing for longer leases and more security of tenure. But actually what consumers want is exactly the opposite. They want more flexibility. They want to be able to move around as they see fit. And especially with the emergence of digital nomads and people who are looking to spend different parts of the year in different places, I would guess that we're going to see a real emergence of more pied-à-terres and different working patterns where people will spend less time in cities, more time in the countryside, and they're going to need property to be able to balance those needs. So I think that's a kind of secular trend that we see in the consumer market. And I think what's really interesting is that in many ways, property is not set up to accommodate those differences. I mean, whether you start at planning law, I mean, in the UK, you've got C1 or C3 planning. Well, what happens when you've got a combination of both? Planning law doesn't really accommodate that. And then you come into contract structures. We do license to occupy for short-term rentals, while it's tenancy agreements and ASTs when you're talking about the long-term market. So contract structures are not really set up for these variances. And what we see more and more is that consumers are often wanting to move into a place, they don't know how long they want to stay, and then they extend and extend until it actually turns into a long-term tenancy.
Yeah.
And what we also see is that sometimes people, they only need a place for 3 months. They don't need a place for 12 months or 18 months. So, whatever their needs are, I think as a property sector, we need to be able to accommodate them. And I think that's where short-term rentals, partnering together with property companies, can really help to figure out what that blend looks like. And the good side about this is that it's all upside and potential yield improvement. So if you take a property life cycle, you obviously have the beginning when you build it and you launch a new, let's say, residential development, for example. There's a whole period of absorption during lease up where actually you're not maximizing the yield during that period. You obviously have void periods during the length of that property asset. And then at the end, of course, you also have that disposal period where often you're not able to have residents there and things like that. So throughout the life cycle, there's opportunities to improve yield. And arguably, even in the midst of the life cycle, I think having a mix of longer term and shorter term tenure within a portfolio helps to maximize yield, but also helps to get access to some of the best customers. Whether you want to call them tenants or we call them guests, but at the end they're customers. And I think, especially in the corporate world, corporate lettings and corporate tenant are kind of the silver goblet and what everybody's looking to achieve, because they're more reliable, they're the kinds of tenants that everyone wants, but often they will start with something a little bit more flexible and only commit to the longer term once they're comfortable that it's right for them. And so I think the two sectors, the long-term residential market and the short-term residential, have a lot that we could be achieving together with the right partnerships and the right open mind. However, there's a big caveat.
Yeah.
That all is dependent on standards, because I think one of the biggest challenges I see for us as a sector is there is a perception that our sector equates to Airbnb. And that ultimately drives perceptions that there are no standards, that there's constantly problems, that this is going to disrupt other things that are going on within the portfolio, and that that's not what people want for their communities, for their portfolios, and for their risk profile, quite honestly. And so I think coming back to your first question, which is why I started this business, it is all about having those standards and those professionalism elements in a new and growing market, so that we get away from that perception that it's a bit of a cowboy world, and actually we partner more and more with companies who have that same professional standard mindset, and that we're able to drive value for them out of this sector, using technology and new routes to market that most property companies won't have today.
So I mean, you've talked, I think, very compellingly about the fact that clearly almost in the same language of commercial real estate, about yields and voids and that utilization of the asset right over the various parts of the life cycle. So, how do property companies access this kind of platform platform, and what do they need to do differently to make the most of it? Because there's clearly some change they need to think about in terms of how they look at their portfolio and think, well, actually, how do we have this mix of longer, shorter term, and almost a staircase, as you describe it, where people kind of come in for that short-term requirement, and then the company decides, well, you're going to be here for 5 years now, and it's now going to turn into a longer-term commitment, sort of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think for property companies, I mean, we can talk about multifamily in the US, build to rent in this country, portfolio owners. Often it is taking a look at that portfolio and understanding where are the opportunities. That's often something that I'll do together with the senior leadership team of different companies to actually sit down and map that out. What are those opportunities? What does that mean in terms of yield improvement and dollars delivered? So I think that's important. But then secondly, it's understanding how you want to engage with short-term rentals. Technology is going to be at the heart of whatever you do. I think often, you hear of estate agents and others who are like, oh, it's easy, I'll just put up some properties on Airbnb. But I'm sure anyone in the property market knows that if you want to attract the best customers, you need to be looking for them in the right places. So one of the things that we do as a strategy is we've got a very multi-channel approach.
Okay.
So we were one of the first partners to work with Expedia. We are one of the first companies globally to work with Marriott Homes and Villas. And having that multi-channel strategy where, of course, we have the Booking.com and Airbnb in the mix, but we also rely on other corporate and more exclusive channels so that you've got that right mix and you're able to maximize the opportunity that you have with the properties that we would manage. Then the second question is, once you've got your distribution strategy clear, how are you going to deliver that? It's a completely different tech ecosystem. So having all the APIs and all the connections into this world is completely different than a traditional property technology would offer. And I think that's important because in our world, everything is instant book. It's not like inquiries come in and then you do viewings and all these things like the traditional property world. People want 3 clicks and they've booked their place. And so the whole tech ecosystem has to be built on real live availability and the ability to convert digitally 100%. Now, do you have a phone line on the other end? Well, yes, of course you do, but that's actually the minority of the customers that you engage with. So that tech ecosystem is there on the distribution and let's say the reservation side. Yeah. But then you also need the technology to support the operations, because it is very different to have a tenant move in for 12 months, 18 months, 2 years versus a guest move in who's going to be there for 3 months and they want their linens changed every week and cleaning, and they're expecting a much higher response rate for anything that goes wrong. They're used to staying in a hotel as an alternative and they're expecting that same level of service. So then the question becomes, as the asset owner, or let's call them the operator from a long-term residential point of view, are they the right people to deliver the operations on the short-term rental side, or do they need a partner to do that as well? We, for example, work with Cadogan Estates and manage one of their assets near Sloane Square, 3 Sloane Gardens. And they took the view that actually they wanted us not only for the technology and the Hosperia ecosystem, but they also wanted Under the Doormat to manage it under the Under the Doormat brand. So we do everything for them end to end. And so that's an example of 2 different choices, because some asset owners or operators may have the team, they may have the capability, in which case they can operate themselves on the ground. But even if they make that choice, if they don't choose the right tech ecosystem, they're going to find that they're not maximizing the opportunity that they've got in front of them.
So, I mean, do you find there are challenges, or obviously it's an opportunity to some extent, about how you quite literally interface with a property company? Because obviously if you're going to deliver that digital experience, they need the internal infrastructure to know what they've got available. So how do you work, and what are the challenges of almost retrofitting that kind of just-in-time ability to book and manage resource with, dare I say, a propco that perhaps hasn't been used to that kind of agility and being able to manage their voids and fill them with that kind of speed and dynamism?
Yeah, so I mean, I think often where it starts is dipping the toe in the water with some simple things. So, the absorption period at the beginning is a really good place to start because availability just gets shut off as soon
Yeah.
as there are tenants moving in.
Yeah.
Really, really simple. And then it tends to move into a place where it's voids, but it's the longer voids. So, let's say there's a seasonality choice that they don't want to put the property on the market straight away. They'd rather wait a few months, for example, because they know that they'll get a better long-term rate if they wait a little while, or because maybe they have a bit of oversupply. So having too many 1 or 2 bedroom flats in the portfolio actually means it drives the prices of all of them down versus holding a few back and then putting them on at the right time. So I think it's more of an evolution because I think there is a learning that goes along with entering this market and, let's say the just-in-time demands that it requires. But there's some simple ways, and often we work together with property companies to help them think through where do they want to start, where do they want to get to, and what does that roadmap look like? So that you don't start and then immediately go, oh my God, but this isn't working. It start with baby steps, learn how it works, learn how things are going to be optimized, and once you've got that model right, then you start switching more on.
And are you beginning to see the propcos sort of change their thinking to reflect this slightly more fluid, dynamic use of assets, or are they finding it hard to make that mindset change of moving away from, well, we either rent it long term or it's empty and then we have a void problem? Are you beginning to see a kind of an understanding of this, probably not so much harder to manage, but just more fluid environment of mixed tenure, if I can use that expression?
Yeah, so I would say we're some way on that journey, but I would definitely say that we're not there yet. And like I say, I think often that's because people are looking at this very black and white. Either I'm doing short-term rentals and Airbnb or I'm not. And I think actually this is a much grayer area because, you might not do single night stays. I mean, to be honest, in most of our portfolio, our minimum is 3 nights anyway. Average length of stay tends to be around 7 nights. But we've seen over the past year that shoot up to more than 20 nights as an average because the types of demands were quite different. And so I think it's defining again, what do you want? And how is that going to help support your broader strategy? Because I think ultimately, yes, it's great to have some incremental yield on your void periods, but ultimately, I think what short-term rentals delivers is a higher yield on your whole portfolio. Because by not having those voids sitting there and not earning income, it takes away that temptation to discount to fill them up.
Yeah.
And as soon as you've discounted, that's 12 months or 24 months of reduced yield. And so even if the short-term rental value doesn't quite deliver what the long-term rental value would, if it will allow you to hold firm on the prices that you're charging for those long-term leases, that's going to drive a big incremental value and yield for that portfolio owner. So I think it's sometimes getting the mindset that actually short-term rentals is doing 2 things. It is providing that stopgap income, but it's also allowing people to hold firmer on the yields they want to get in their overall portfolio.
As you say, putting a floor on that rental expectation and protecting the other income parts of the slices of yield you're getting. So, I mean, a lot of our members are obviously working in the propcos. They're working as consultants. That they're obviously advising on that kind of ultimate asset management. I mean, what would be your advice to them about how they sort of get their clients to start thinking about this? What are the kind of some of the nuts and bolts? And you mentioned the very sensible approach of, baby steps, start the journey. But what would be your sort of 15, your elevator pitch in terms of saying, well, actually, this is the best way to start broaching this idea and talking about how you can actually start the journey?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the best thing to do is to really understand straight away whether you want to operate or whether you want simply a tech partner. Because then you'll know when you start engaging with companies who can help the delivery of this value. And so for us, what we find often is that property companies will come to us and they don't actually know what they want. So they know they want the value that short-term rentals will deliver. And then the first discussions we have with them are helping them to bottom out if they want a tech solution or if they want a full solution. So, whether that is calling us up and having us help through that journey, or indeed whether it is figuring that out and then knowing who you want to partner with that's going to be able to support this. I think the one thing that is really important is knowing that it is a very different industry. And while it seems simple on the outset, it's like anything. I mean, the reason why people come to your consultants is because they're experts. And no one in the property sector would say, don't get a surveyor involved. In the same way, why would anyone say, don't get someone who knows short-term rentals involved? We can just do this all ourselves. And so I think there's a danger of thinking this is really simple and really easy. And so I guess my advice would be, look, take the advice you give to your clients already, which is get an expert involved so that you can map this out, so that you can actually come up with the figures and understand what value can be delivered early on. I mean, I'm often talking to build-to-rent developers, even the financiers, because at the very early stage, understanding what impact this will have on the value of a particular development is actually really crucial. And it might only be 1 or 2 years down the line that it goes live, and actually we then partner and work with them on that. But I think thinking about it early on is really important so that it's built into the entire strategy and financial model almost from the outset of any new residential development.
I'm interested to sort of go back a few steps because you mentioned standards earlier on, and I guess it's also intriguing in terms of trends and standards that multifamily or build to rent as it's known over here has clearly put a lot of focus on that kind of front of house concierge sort of quality of experience, as well as clearly the bricks and mortar. But have you seen that as a great positive driver about people thinking much more about that kind of front of house experience, that quality, which ultimately flows into standards, whether it's any part of the journey? Have you seen that as a really positive thing that's almost come across from the US in terms of how multifamily has grown over there and been that real hospitality front of house quality experience, piece?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one thing I didn't mention at the beginning is that I chair the UK industry body, the Short-Term Accommodation Association. And one of the things that we've been doing as an industry is getting those standards in place. So we partnered with Quality and Tourism, and we got the backing of the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government for our accreditation scheme. So for the first time, our sector has a clear accreditation program. And I think that's exciting because it means that anyone that, let's say someone in the property sector would work with, if they have that accreditation, it ensures that the right standards and processes are in place with that company that they're partnering with. So I think that's one thing. I think from a consumer point of view, what we see is that as corporates and government enter the market, standards are becoming a baseline requirement, not an optional thing to have. And what's been really interesting is coming out of COVID, we created as an industry a platform called Trusted Stays. And that platform allows any professional operator who does short-term rentals to put their property assets up on this platform and to access corporate and government bookings. And it was the first organization in our sector to win a government RFP back in February of this year. Now, as a result of that, we've now partnered with the UK Apartment Association, which is the build to rent sector association, because they recognize that their members are looking also for those corporate stays. And I think what this does is it brings together two industries, the property industry and the short-term rental industry. And as I say, then in terms of that hospitality or kind of customer service angle, it's a discussion about who's better to deliver that. Is it a short-term rental operator or is it a build-to-rent operator, for example? I actually think the capability exists in both. I don't think it has to come from one or the other on the operational side, but I do think that whoever is doing it has to have that hospitality and customer mindset, which, as you say, has been a growing trend in any case in this market.
Yeah. No, and I suppose what is fascinating, as you say, is so many of the parallels with commercial real estate in terms of flexibility, and also, I suppose, driven by COVID, that sense of making places attractive to stay and go, that we have to actively encourage people back into the workplace in the context of commercial real estate, that places need to have that hospitality, that even a commercial office now has to be thinking, we have to attract people. We want to make these places productive, safe, inspiring places to actually go to. So it's funny how the two assets are becoming, not blurred, that's the wrong word, but becoming more aligned in terms of how people have to actively manage these assets, that you can't just sign a 25-year lease on a commercial building anymore. And in the same way, rentals are of different lengths, and the arguably consumers are more demanding in that sense, or their expectations are perhaps rising.
I mean, definitely expectations are rising. It's interesting because we were talking to an asset owner who just took over an asset that hadn't been renovated for 20 years. And pre-COVID, it was doing really well, and COVID pulled the rug out from underneath it. But arguably, I think that old school mentality that you can just have an asset and do nothing to it for a very long period of time, I think that's a thing of the past. I think COVID has only accelerated that change, as you say, both in commercial and residential real estate. But I also think, we all can think of the younger generation, people in their 20s, they expect everything at the click of a button. And I think that kind of mentality, that everything is at your fingertips, that there's always someone to help you, all that kind of thing, is an expectation. So if you want to be attracting the best clients, then you've got to know how you're going to provide that right level of service. And I think that's where, in our sector, you start to see the emergence of brands. Obviously, Doormat being one of them, One Fine Stay being another, Sonder coming up. These are all names that people have probably heard of by now. And I think that emergence is happening precisely because there's a demand for our type of product, but also because consumers are looking for that level of service and a brand that they can trust, so that it isn't just a potluck peer-to-peer kind of activity. And I think that's going to be really important across the property sector, but certainly in our segment.
I suppose, because it's an obvious comment to make, but obviously, short-term renters are multiple buyers, so they're going to be returning to different locations, but they'll want that sense. Well, okay, interestingly, you mentioned the digital nomads. I was reading an article in The Economist about that, and these people have those expectations, and they'll decide, well, I'll spend, the summer here, and I may go somewhere else for the winter. So it's that sense that they want to rock up at city A and then city B and have that kind of branded experience. And it reminds me, whenever we go anywhere with my kids, the first thing they look for is the Wi-Fi key. So they're just thinking, right, we have this expectation now of the kind of level of service we want. They're not checking the bathroom, they're checking for the Wi-Fi. So.
Completely.
Well, it's been fascinating to talk, and I look forward to chatting again and seeing how this market develops. But a really interesting theme here around this this alignment of trends in commercial, residential real estate, the trends from America in terms of multifamily, and the fact that there's obviously a huge opportunity here for asset owners to make their properties work more profitably and deliver a great service. So it's been great to talk, Merilee, and look forward to talking to you again.
No, it's been wonderful to be here, and I look forward to talking to many of your members about how we can help them access this new market.
Indeed, great stuff. Well, good to talk.